Yo, what's up guys, it's Talon. Today we're going to be ranking the roles from easiest to hardest to play in Wild Rift. So yesterday's video was about the easiest and hardest roles to climb on, but now I'm just talking about the skill required to play these roles, which are the most difficult. And I think it's a good video to couple with yesterday's video because then you'll kind of have an idea of what the easiest and hardest roles are to actually play, and then also the easiest and hardest roles to climb on, which might allow you to understand which role you might want to learn based on these various factors. So anyways, let's get right into the easiest role to play in Wild Rift. Okay, so the easiest overall role for me is going to be support. Now, I didn't always think this wasn't always in my opinion. I often considered what is going to be number 4 as the easiest role. But the reasoning for support for me largely comes down to the fact that basically half of the champions are incredibly easy. That's going to be one of the main points. In enchanters, there's very few enchanters that actually require very much skill, mechanically speaking. Now, there's certainly macro aspects of the game, understanding rotations, where to be on the map, other things like this that are difficult, but in terms of pure mechanics, enchanters are by far the easiest archetype of champions in the game, and those reside largely in the support role. So mechanically speaking, the role is very easy. Even the more tanky supports, a lot of the tanky supports aren't mechanically difficult. Apart from Pyke, Rakan, Thresh, most of the other ones like Leona, Alistar, and Nautilus are pretty straightforward, pretty easy to play, mechanically speaking. However, you do have to have macro understanding for this role. So if you are a player who really struggles with, macro, but your mechanics are quite good, this probably isn't the role for you. But if you feel like your understanding of the game is decent, but oftentimes you struggle with your champions, this is more of like that type of role that you would want to play. And the reason that I'm saying that it's still not too hard mechanically that I would put it higher, or rather macro-wise that I would put it higher, is because you don't necessarily have to lane. You don't have to super focus on the lane. You have a lot more time to think. It gives you a lot more patience. Now, you certainly have to focus on the lane still and playing with your teammate in lane, but it's just a bit less focused compared to someone who's having to focus on last hits constantly, or having to, play by themselves in the lane. Like, these types of things kind of makes the role a little bit easier. So that, alongside the fact that the champions, for the most part, are pretty easy, especially in terms of enchanters, is why I would put it last. Now, if I was solely ranking the tanks, like, I would say that tanks are harder as a whole to play than enchanters, and they would probably be like at number 4 if just it was only tank supports I was ranking. But obviously we're ranking the entire role, which includes enchanters, who are very straightforward to play, even though just because I am saying this is the easiest role does not mean that it is an easy role. I do genuinely believe that every single role in the game requires skill in different ways, and depending on your strengths or weaknesses as a player, it's going to be different for whether this role is the easiest for you or the hardest for you. So overall, the mechanical aspect of this role is why it is going to be at number 5. So if support is the macro-focused role that doesn't require much mechanics, then ADC is the exact opposite. It requires quite good mechanical ability, but frankly, you can turn your brain off quite frequently in this role, and that's why it's going to be at number 4. Now, the mechanical aspect of this role is quite difficult because not only do the champions such as I'm thinking of Draven, Ezreal. A lot of skill shots are on these champions. Varus has skill shots, Ezreal again. Many skill shots. You have to kite very well. You have to, make sure your spacing is very good. You just generally have to be very, very focused on dealing maximum damage while still not dying because you have a short amount of life. You have not very much HP, so it's quite easy to die on this role. It's very punishing. So again, having that really proficient mechanical ability is extremely important on this role. But you don't really need the most mechanical ability, or rather the most macro understanding to play well on this role, because generally speaking, your support makes a lot of the decisions for you. You're just kind of there to deal damage. You're just there to deal max damage, but it is very punishing if you don't play mechanically well or you don't keep track of spells. Like, you have to be very, very focused on this role, and you have to be very, very good at that one thing, which is dealing damage while not dying, which it sounds easy, but in practice it's hard when there's a Zed coming at you and there's a Dr. Mundo running at you, and there's a Karma shielding them as they run at you, and all these things, right? It can be very difficult, which is why you have to keep track of spells. You have to make sure you're hitting your abilities very effectively. You're keeping track of what spells you need to use for your opponents. All of these things in the mind is what you need to really focus on. So it requires a lot of focus and a lot of mechanical ability, but it doesn't really require much understanding of the game. Generally speaking, your support's the one deciding whether or not he wants to roam or not, whereas you're just staying in your lane until the mid game and then rotating towards mid. Then you hit the mid tower when it's an easy time to hit the mid tower, and when you can't hit the mid tower, you just farm and you focus on getting into the team fight. And you're just generally, it's a very straightforward role. It's not too complicated in terms of what you have to do, which is why oftentimes if you watch me coach people on ADC compared to other roles, I don't have quite as much to say to them in terms of the macro understanding of the game or what they should be doing, because the entire focus is just get gold, deal damage, don't die, right? It's very straightforward, but to me it's quite hard, that aspect of the game, for many people, getting super good mechanically, which is why I do still think it's more difficult than support, even though typically speaking I would say it's harder to learn macro than mechanics. But because of the fact that you do still need somewhat of a macro understanding in order to get that goal onto yourself as an ADC, and the fact that the mechanical requirement for this role is a lot higher than other roles, especially in terms of keeping track of spells and not dying and these types of things, is why I would have it above support. But the fact that you don't need to understand macro that well is why it's still one of the easier roles and comes in overall at number 4. Now, I think this is going to be the most disagreed upon role or choice, and that's that jungle, in my opinion, is number 3, which many people would not agree on. The reasoning for jungle being at number 3 and not higher is because you don't have to lane. Lane phase is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult parts of the game. It requires you to directly outplay another laner while simultaneously keeping track of jungle pathing. You have to be very aware of where jungler is while simultaneously being aggressive in the timers that you have to be aggressive, and more passive in the timers that you can be passive. You have to trade very well, keep track of enemy spells and tools, and understand what they can do to respond to you. And this is just a completely lacking aspect of jungle. You don't have to do this whatsoever. Now, the difficult parts about jungle are, of course, it is as well a more macro-focused role and less mechanical role, similar to support. Oftentimes people say support is a second jungler for this exact reason. So you do have to have a very good understanding of tracking the enemy jungler, of understanding where he's going to be so that you can invade, understanding how lane states work in order to actually understand when you can gank and when you can't gank. But the reality is that oftentimes the best choice on jungle is the same choice every game, which is to farm when your camps are up and only go and gank when your camps aren't up, unless there's like an objective spawning. So it's very straightforward. It's very similar in many games, which is why, to me, even though it has these certain nuanced, decision-making things where you can be like, oh, his entire red side's up, I can invade him there because I see him on the bot side. The reality is that usually that jungler, if he's playing properly, he should have been farming that red side. He shouldn't have been ganking on the opposite side of the map when his camps are up. So like a lot of these, more complex decision-making processes only occur when the enemy are playing poorly. And if everyone's really playing like actually at an optimal way in the game, like I don't think that this role requires nearly as many things to go into it. And again, mechanically, compared to the last 2 roles, also ignore that int on the screen. You did not see me do that. Apart from the more macro focused thing, the mechanical part of this role is just much simpler compared to playing mid lane or playing top lane, which obviously are the top 2 roles, as you can infer from the rest of this rating. So just that the fact that, again, mechanically speaking, it's not that hard, and it actually follows a very similar thought process in a lot of games, and doesn't really require as much nuanced thinking as you might think. Like once you really understand the basics of jungle, that really is going to get you through a very high ranking all the way up. In my opinion, you really only need to understand the basics of jungle in order to climb even to Grandmaster, sometimes Challenger. So that's why overall it is going to be at number 3. All right, so at number 2, we're going to actually have mid lane, which I also kind of think people might have disagreed with here. And this is a very hard choice for me, deciding between mid and top for the top 2 most difficult roles. But the reason that I have mid lane as one of the most difficult roles in the game is going to be because mid lane requires you to understand pretty much everything that a jungler needs to understand while also having to lane. You need to be able to understand what timers to gank people on. You need to understand when you should roam, how you should manage your wave in order to create a roam without losing stuff. You need to understand how to play a lot of different matchups, because not only do you have to lane against assassins, mages, ADCs, or tanky champions, basically every type of champion in the game resides in this role, which means not only do you need to understand how to play them, but also to play against them. There's just a lot of variety in this role, which means the overall knowledge that you have to have is a lot. It has a lot of, ability to impact various parts of the map as well. Of course, since you're in the middle of the lane, not only do you get ganked from either side, you could get ganked from the support, the top laner, the jungler, sometimes even the ADC. Just everyone can gank you. Just so much occurs. It requires you to keep track of a lot of things. Again, mechanically, a lot of different types of champions. You have to lane all these things. So the only real reason that I have it at number 2 and not number 1 is because it's easier to find impact in this role. It's easier to understand how to carry on this role. It's easier to understand how to do that. You don't have to think as much of how can I involve myself in the play, because you're involved naturally by being the mid laner. You're in the middle of the map. Everything occurs around you. You need to go to the dragon. Well, oh, you're already in the mid lane. You're basically there already. Just go over to the left a little bit. You need to go help Herald or Baron. Just walk to the right a bit. It's right there. So it's easier to kind of understand how you can actually find impact in comparison to other roles that are on side lanes, for example. Of course, top lane being one of those, which is the main reason for, you know, it actually not being number one. So again, to reiterate, really mechanically challenging role, requires you to lane, requires you to have a lot of macro understanding as well. Extremely difficult role, definitely top 2 hardest. I think a lot of people could debate that it's the hardest, but because of the fact that it's a little easier to find impact, I do have it at number 2 rather than number 1. All right, so that of course means that the hardest role in Wild Rift, in my opinion, is top lane. So let me give you the reasons for why. The first one is going to be, it's much more punishing if you do die. You know, similar to all of the other roles that lane, as we mentioned, you have to, you know, lane, and lane phase is one of the most difficult parts of the game. But not only do you have to lane, if you mess up in this lane, you get screwed over way harder than any role, because it's a lot less likely that you're going to have your jungler to bail you out because of the fact that you're very isolated. It's going to be very likely that if you do get camped, that you just end up dying and there's not much you can do about it. There's just a lot more punishment that occurs in a long lane like that. If you fall behind even, you know, a couple hundred gold in the item power spike that the enemy hits is just slightly better than yours, you pretty much permanently lose trades for the rest of the game and are on the back foot. Not only that, but when you do get a lead in this lane, it's very hard to actually find the impact because you need to decide whether or not to roam or to give up your own turret, which is a very difficult decision a lot of times because you're deciding between letting an enemy get fed and relying on your team to be sufficient on their own. As you're able to get to your power spike, you have to understand playing around power spikes, item back timers, all of these things, which are understood in mid lane as well. But like I said, the fact that it's more punishing and more difficult to find actual impact is extremely difficult. Alongside that fact, oftentimes you're playing melee champions, but a lot of enemies will play ranged champions. Whereas oftentimes when you're in mid lane, you get to, you know, play more ranged champions or champs with better wave clear. It's easier to not get punished as hard in a melee versus range matchup, even if you are playing a melee champion, because often that's going to be an assassin that you're playing in mid lane. But when you're playing a bruiser in top lane or playing a lot of the common top lane champions into a ranged champion, it requires a little bit more of an understanding of how to actually play that matchup, which I do think is completely doable and not actually as difficult as people make it sound to be. But I do know how much we all hate playing against ranged top laners, and it certainly can be a very difficult thing to do, which is another very hard aspect of top lane that isn't quite as common in mid lane. So like overall, you know, mid lane and top lane, they have a lot of the similar difficulties, but the fact that impact is harder to find in top lane is overall why I would say it's the hardest role, but very debatable for sure. I think any of the top 3 roles you could debate, and I'd be able to hear an argument for those for sure. But that's going to do it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this ranking of the roles. Let me know your own rankings, and if you agree with the kind of like my overall thought process, or if you have other things to mention in terms of all of this. As always, as a rank 5 sovereign player, I do coaching for just $15 an hour. Just DM me on Discord, Talon1169, or through the link in the description to my Discord to add me there as well. And I'll see you guys in the next video.